They said her house still sighed at night, as if it were remembering the hands that built it and the sins that never left its walls. When the candles burned low and the marsh fog crept inland, you could hear her daughters singing, softly, like a prayer they were forced to repeat long after the prayer had lost its God. Before we continue, take a breath. The past is closer than you think. Subscribe to remember what others forgot. The widow of Savannah arrived in the Low Country the way a storm arrives, suddenly, and with the quiet promise of ruin. She came dressed in black silk that refused to wrinkle, her mourning veil long enough to drag across the dust of her carriage path. Her name was Eliza Harrow, a name whispered with reverence and fear among the moss-choked estates of the Carolina coast. Her late husband, Captain Harrow, had drowned somewhere off Tybee Sound, leaving her the house, the land, and 2 daughters whose eyes never met the sun again. Harrow Hall sat on the edge of the river like a memory too heavy to sink. Its columns leaned as though listening, its shutters creaked like arthritic bones. Locals avoided the property. They said the marsh water near it tasted of iron and dreams. Once a week Eliza's carriage would appear at the market square, its wheels gleaming with an oil that smelled faintly of camphor and something sweeter, something wrong. She never left the carriage. Servants, mute, expressionless, collected what she ordered: candles by the crate, ink, glass vials, and fresh white lilies no one ever saw in bloom again. Inside the house time had stopped. The mirrors were veiled in gauze, the clocks wound down to silence. The daughters, Clara and June, were pale as unlit wax, their hair bound in the same braided crown their mother had worn since her widowhood. To them, Eliza spoke of destiny, of perfect blood, of a lineage that must remain untouched by the failures of common hearts. She called it her inheritance of the pure. At night, when thunder rolled across the wetlands, Eliza would pace the upper hallway with a candle held before her face, its light trembling on portraits whose eyes had long been painted shut. The girls listened from their rooms as her steps echoed like a metronome marking time for a ghost that could not rest. What the townspeople didn't see, what no one saw, was the narrow staircase behind the library wall. It led to a cellar no larger than a chapel, where the widow kept her ledgers, thick books bound in cracked leather, filled not with numbers but with names. Some were crossed out in black ink, others circled in red. To her, each name was an ingredient, a possibility, a symbol in the strange arithmetic of lineage she believed would restore her family's glory. She told her daughters that the Harrow line had been chosen once, in another century, by something older than the crown or the church. "We were meant to refine the world," she whispered. "But the world has grown unworthy of us." Clara trembled when she heard it, June only stared. The widow took their silence as faith. By autumn the air around the estate had changed. Birds stopped nesting in the trees that framed the drive. The gardener, one of the few outsiders permitted through the gate, swore he heard voices beneath the soil, like air escaping from deep water. He left without notice, abandoning his shears on the lawn. The widow said nothing. She simply locked the gates and told her daughters the world beyond had grown diseased. In town rumors gathered like storm clouds. Some said she practiced medicine, others that she was building a new order of women immune to death. A preacher from Beaufort rode to the estate once, carrying his Bible like a weapon. He was gone by dusk, and his horse was found 3 days later near the marsh, reins dragging, eyes wide and milk-white. Inside Harrow Hall, candlelight ruled where sunlight once lived. The daughters learned to read from medical treatises and fragments of Latin texts. They learned to sew bandages instead of dresses. When one of them asked why no one ever came to visit, the widow smiled. "We are visited," she said, glancing toward the ceiling as if something listened from above the beams. "We are always being watched." That winter, a new sound joined the whispers of the house, the rhythmic creak of wood from the uppermost room, where the widow locked herself for hours. The daughters were forbidden to enter. From beneath the door came the smell of salt and iron and candle smoke. Sometimes in the brief pause between thunder and rain, they thought they heard her speaking to someone, a second voice soft and pleading, the reply always her own. When spring returned, the river rose and flooded the lower fields. The townspeople claimed it was punishment for the widow's arrogance, but no one dared cross the property to warn her. She had become a legend already, her name stitched into fireside stories meant to hush children and warn the curious. Yet within those crumbling walls she was only a woman chasing ghosts, her husband's, her family's, and perhaps her own. One night, Clara stood at the window and watched the will-o'-the-wisps drift across the flooded grass. Their faint blue glow reflected in her eyes like the memory of freedom. She thought she saw figures moving among them, shadows shaped like her mother and sister, walking hand in hand into the fog. When she turned, her mother was behind her, candle raised, expression unreadable. "Do you wish to leave us, child?" the widow asked. Clara shook her head, though she wasn't sure what truth that gesture carried. The candle guttered. The house sighed again as if relieved to find them still within its grasp. The spring fog clung to Harrow Hall like a shroud, curling through the broken shutters and slipping beneath the heavy doors that Eliza Harrow had sealed months before. Inside, the house had grown restless. The creaking of floorboards, once predictable, now seemed deliberate, as if the very structure were aware of trespassers, or perhaps plotting its own alarms. Clara moved silently along the hallway, her slippers pressed against the cold, warped wood, listening to the soft murmurs that the wind carried through the gaps. Sometimes they sounded like whispers of servants long gone, other times like the echo of her mother's voice repeating the same words over and over. The line must be preserved. The line must endure. Outside, the marsh had begun to reclaim the lower grounds. The river's slow swell painted the fields in muted silver, and the cypress trees bent under the weight of the mist. From the market town of Savannah, rumors traveled like smoke. Some said that the widow Harrow had begun experiments in human temperament, others that her daughters no longer slept in beds but in chambers lined with books and glass jars. People avoided the estate, yet they could not resist the stories, whispering about the woman who bent fate itself to her will. Josephine, the younger of the sisters, had begun keeping a secret journal. Beneath the loose floorboard of her room, she wrote feverishly, recording the nights when the candlelight behind the library shutters flickered and moved despite the absence of wind. She documented the patterns of her mother's pacing, the strange deliveries that arrived by carriage from Charleston, and the way Clara sometimes disappeared for hours, returning with eyes vacant and hands trembling. In her entries, Josephine wondered if her mother's obsession with perfection extended beyond the lines of family and into something far more sinister. Isolated in her room, Josephine listened to the house breathe. The wind rattled the shutters and the river murmured below, carrying with it the distant cries of animals and perhaps of the estate itself. She could hear Clara's faint sobs through the walls, a sound she did not dare answer. Each night brought the slow pulse of fear, a rhythm she felt in her chest even when the candle's flame steadied. Sometimes she thought she saw figures moving in the shadows of the hallways, slender, silent, and impossible to identify. Their presence was both familiar and alien, like echoes of her own mind wandering without her consent. Isaiah Hale, the new steward, had begun his own observations. Assigned to the stables and gardens, he moved among the horses and hedges, careful to blend into the background. He noticed the meticulous order of Harrow Hall's routines, the way servants avoided glances at the upper floors, and the strange patterns of candlelight that illuminated rooms no one admitted to entering. At night, he could sometimes hear the soft tapping of footsteps above him, deliberate and unhurried, passing behind doors that should have remained closed. His curiosity burned against the strict rules of silence and obedience that governed every corner of the estate. The widow herself, oblivious to the scrutiny, became more exacting. She measured her daughters' growth, their temperaments, their quietest responses. She praised obedience and punished hesitation with the coldest gestures, silent meals, dismissed words, or long stares that seemed to pierce the soul. Her lectures to the girls were sometimes spoken, sometimes whispered into journals, as if writing alone could carry out the command of her will. Clara had learned to move like a shadow, anticipating her mother's expectations before they were spoken aloud, while Josephine began to question whether shadowing obedience was the only form of survival she could endure. In town, the preacher who had fled Beaufort returned once more, though no one knew it. He observed the estate from the marsh edge, noting the candlelight that never went out, even in the dead of night. He saw figures crossing the lawns in silence, and the slow, deliberate motion of the widow herself from window to window. Something about the estate was unholy, though no one could name it precisely. It was not just the fear of her daughters, nor the isolation, but the sense that the house itself had been twisted by her intent, warped into a vessel of her own obsession. One evening, during a particularly violent storm, Josephine noticed a pattern in the house's creaks. They were not random as she had once believed, but followed a rhythm, an intentional arrangement of sound that marked the passing of time or perhaps the execution of some hidden design. She traced it through the hallways, counting, listening until she reached the library. There, behind the shelves, she found the faintest draft escaping from a narrow crack. It smelled of old paper and iron, and the candlelight revealed a faint keyhole glinting in the shadows. Isaiah too felt the stirring of suspicion. While pruning the azaleas along the west wing, he saw the daughters at their windows, pale and still, their gazes fixed on something beyond the grounds. He could not tell if they were watching the storm, or if they were looking for someone who did not exist. It was clear that the widow's control extended far beyond her household. It reached into the mind, bending will into reflection of her own obsession. The estate was no longer just a home, it was a labyrinth of discipline and quiet terror, where every footstep, every sigh, every glance could betray one to unseen observation. By midnight the storm had intensified. Lightning split the sky above the river, illuminating the house in jagged flashes, each revealing the precise geometry of shadows that seemed to march through the corridors. Clara and Josephine huddled together, whispering of what they had glimpsed behind the locked doors. The widow, upstairs, moved like a conductor, her candle marking the tempo of some private ritual. Outside, Isaiah listened, heart hammering, as the estate itself seemed to breathe and pulse under the weight of its mistress's will. That night, Josephine recorded her first definitive observation. The house kept secrets that were alive. They shifted with the light and the wind, hiding in the spaces between floors, behind walls, and under the floorboards. The shadows moved not of their own accord, but by command of something older than fear, older than the widow herself. As she penned her words, she heard the faintest creak, a sound she recognized immediately as her mother's footfall, deliberate, measuring, inevitable. The storm passed, leaving the estate drenched and silent. Outside, the marsh was a mirror of the sky, reflecting the faint light of dawn. Within the walls, Clara and Josephine prepared for the day, each aware that nothing about the house, about their mother, or about the estate was as it seemed. Every movement, every glance, every breath was observed, catalogued, and folded into the grand design of the widow's obsessive mind. And somewhere in the garden, Isaiah watched, waiting for the moment when the shadows might finally reveal the truth of Harrow Hall's silent, creeping dread. The summer of 1836 arrived with a relentless heat that seemed to press the very air into the corridors of Harrow Hall. The widow moved through her house with the precision of a clockmaker, her black gown whispering against the polished floors, each step measured, each gesture exact. Clara and Josephine had long learned to anticipate her movements, yet the anticipation only heightened the sense of unease that pervaded every room. Even in the garden, where the river breeze offered a fragile relief, the estate seemed to pulse with her presence, the shadows of the oak trees stretching like fingers toward the house, carrying with them secrets too heavy to speak. Josephine had begun to notice subtle changes in her mother's manner. The meticulous attention to every movement, the fascination with patterns, the endless cataloging of behaviors, it all suggested a purpose beyond mere control. Eliza Harrow did not simply want obedience. She wanted the daughters themselves to embody her vision, to become living instruments of her perfection. Clara, older and more resigned, moved through her days as if walking a narrow bridge between daylight and shadow, while Josephine's mind churned with the growing realization that her mother's designs were neither benevolent nor natural. Visitors came occasionally, though never without strict purpose. Merchants from Charleston or Beaufort would arrive, briefcases of ledgers in hand, and the widow would assess them with an inscrutable gaze. Her questions were precise, her judgment immediate. The daughters were required to observe these meetings silently, noting every flicker of expression, every inflection in voice. Josephine kept a small notebook hidden beneath her pillow, recording these observations, knowing instinctively that one day this record might serve as a map to the truth, or a guide to escape. Even the servants felt the tightening grip of the widow's obsession. Isaiah, whose work in the stables allowed him occasional freedom to observe, noted the careful choreography of the household. Meals were served with silent timing, the daughters' movements synchronized to the ticking of clocks no one wound. Occasionally the servants whispered, though always behind closed doors, of patterns too precise to be chance, of a mistress whose mind reached into every corner of the estate, bending even the shadows to her will. One evening, as the sun sank beneath the marsh horizon, Josephine followed Clara to the upper hall where the widow conducted her nightly ritual of inspection. The girls paused outside the study door, listening to the soft rustle of paper and the scratching of quill on parchment. Occasionally the widow's voice cut through, low and deliberate, directing invisible hands as if orchestrating some unseen audience. Josephine's pulse quickened. She had begun to realize that the study was not merely a room of accounts, but a sanctuary of secrets, a place where the widow's obsession with order and perfection was documented, immortalized in meticulous script. Clara glanced at Josephine, eyes wide with the unspoken understanding of shared fear. In the silence of that moment, the elder daughter conveyed a warning without words. The study was off limits and the secrets within were not to be discovered. Yet Josephine could not quell her curiosity. Each night, she lingered in shadow, attempting to catch a glimpse of the widow's work, of the precise mechanisms by which she controlled not only the household but the very lives of her daughters. Meanwhile, Isaiah observed from the garden's periphery. His purpose, though unspoken, had become increasingly clear: to understand the widow's designs, to map the patterns of control, to seek the possibility of liberation. He noted the daughters' careful compliance, the subtle signals passed between them, and the invisible lines of authority that stretched from the widow to every corner of Harrow Hall. The estate, he realized, was not merely a home but a living organism, its pulse synchronized to the will of its mistress. As midsummer approached, strange events began to occur with increasing frequency. Doors that had been secured from the inside were found ajar. Windows whispered of intrusions that left no trace. Candles flickered violently without cause, and the daughters reported seeing figures in the corners of rooms, vanishing when approached. Josephine recorded these incidents meticulously, convinced that they were connected to the widow's intricate surveillance, though she could not yet discern how or why. The townspeople of Savannah, meanwhile, remained both fearful and fascinated. Stories circulated of the widow's obsession, of her daughter's peculiar comportment, and of the house itself, which seemed alive with unspoken knowledge. Visitors claimed to have heard music without musicians, footsteps that did not belong to any known resident, and the soft, sorrowful singing of girls whose laughter had been long extinguished. The estate's reputation as a place of mystery and dread solidified, though no one dared enter its gates without invitation. Inside the house, the tension mounted. Clara, increasingly resigned, had begun to accept her mother's vision as inevitable, while Josephine's defiance grew quietly, nurtured by her journal and by Isaiah's discreet observations. The daughters communicated in subtle gestures, passing messages through shared glances, the brush of a hand, or the positioning of objects in the rooms they inhabited. Each day brought new tests, new trials designed by the widow to measure obedience, endurance, and alignment with her ideal of perfection. One stormy night, the house seemed to pulse with an almost tangible life. The wind shrieked through the shutters, rain hammered the roof, and lightning illuminated the hallways in stark, fleeting clarity. Josephine and Clara huddled together, listening to the widow's measured footsteps above, realizing that the control she wielded extended not only over the household but over the very atmosphere of the estate. It was a dominion of fear and precision, a silent choreography that left no room for error, no possibility of privacy. In that charged silence, Josephine resolved to act. Her journal had become more than a record, it was a repository of patterns, a map of control, a guide to understanding her mother's methods. If the house was a labyrinth, the journal might be her way through it. She would need allies, but trust was scarce within Harrow Hall. The daughter's complicity, whether conscious or compelled, added another layer of danger. Yet Josephine's mind, sharpened by fear and determination, began to conceive of a plan to observe, to learn, and perhaps one day to escape the widow's meticulous dominion. As the storm passed, leaving the estate cloaked in mist and silence, the house seemed to exhale. The daughters retired to their rooms, the servants resumed their quiet labors, and the widow finally descended from her nightly vigil, her black gown sweeping the floors as she moved toward the study. The estate, for all its order and dread, remained in motion, alive with anticipation, each shadow a potential witness, each candle a sentinel. And outside, Isaiah continued his silent watch, recording, learning, waiting for the right moment to challenge the authority that governed every corner of Harrow Hall. The first chill of autumn settled over Harrow Hall, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and distant river water. The widow's obsidian eyes seemed to gleam sharper against the dimming candlelight, her black gown a moving shadow along the hallways. That night, Josephine lingered behind the study door, listening to her mother's deliberate steps. Each footfall echoed like a tolling bell through the house, marking the passage of secrets that had been held too long. The widow's obsession had shifted from mere control to a darker design. Not only the daughters, not only the household, but the very lineage of blood itself. Josephine had pieced together fragments for months. The meticulous records, the whispered instructions to the servants, the strange patterns of arrivals and disappearances. But it was Isaiah who first confirmed the depth of the horror. Hidden behind the garden hedges, he had observed a carriage arrive in the dead of night, its contents unseen but unmistakable in purpose. Figures were escorted silently from the back door into the lower chambers of the estate, rooms previously off-limits, and a muffled cry had escaped before the heavy doors closed. Josephine read his account later in the secret notes he risked passing her, and her stomach churned. The house's pulse was no longer merely oppressive, it was alive with acts she had only feared to imagine. That evening, during a rare moment of relative quiet, Josephine followed Clara to the corridor that led to the upper east wing. Here, the widow conducted her most private ritual, inspecting the daughters not only for behavior but for evidence of conformity to her unyielding ideals. Clara's eyes were trained downward, but Josephine could see her shoulders stiffen as the widow's gaze passed over her, assessing, measuring, cataloging. Then the revelation came, not in words but in the subtle gestures, the tools and charts left visible only to those who knew where to look. The daughters themselves, instruments of observation, were also subjects in an experiment centuries in the making. The truth unfolded in fragments that night, like shards of broken glass reflecting candlelight. The widow's ledger, previously thought to record only household matters, contained intricate diagrams of lineage, charts of bloodlines, and notes on selective traits. There were references to servants, to daughters, to children who had vanished quietly into the lower chambers, each entry meticulous and merciless. Josephine felt a cold wave of comprehension. Her mother had extended the same principles that guided her control of the household to a far more sinister end. It was no longer discipline alone, it was the manipulation of inheritance, of flesh, of generations. Clara's quiet resignation contrasted sharply with Josephine's rising panic. She traced the diagrams, noting names, dates, and outcomes. The figures in the ledger were more than individuals, they were variables in a carefully calculated design, a plan to shape bloodlines for some unknowable perfection. The thought that her own existence might have been shaped by this system, that the choices of birth, body, and spirit might have been dictated, sent chills through her. She looked at her sister, and for the first time, Clara seemed almost human in her terror. Meanwhile, Isaiah moved cautiously through the shadowed gardens. He had memorized the servants' routines and the precise timings of the widow's nightly inspections. Tonight, he would attempt something bold, to reach the hidden chambers beneath the hall where the younger women, taken under the pretense of instruction or medical care, were held. The carriage observed earlier had delivered more than food or supplies, it had brought subjects to continue the widow's grim experiment. Isaiah's heart pounded, not merely from fear but from the weight of knowing that each moment delayed could seal the fate of another life. Inside the estate, the widow continued her inspection with an almost supernatural awareness. Candlelight reflected off the polished surfaces of tables and ledgers, revealing diagrams only she seemed to understand fully. Daughters and servants moved through the hallways like actors in a rehearsal they had not written, their performances precise, their errors immediately corrected. And yet, within this oppressive choreography, cracks began to show. Clara hesitated, Josephine observed, and Isaiah's movements became another variable the widow had not anticipated. The house, for all its order, had begun to reveal its vulnerabilities. That night, a storm rolled over the marshes, rattling windows and snapping branches against the estate's walls. Lightning illuminated the estate in intermittent bursts, revealing glimpses of corridors, hidden staircases, and the long shadows of figures moving with purpose. Josephine and Isaiah, now clandestinely aligned, observed from different vantage points. Every movement of the widow, every interaction with her daughters, every subtle command to the servants was a piece of the pattern they needed to understand. And for the first time, the inevitability that had loomed over Harrow Hall seemed slightly less absolute. Inside the hidden chambers, the younger women huddled together, unaware that observation eyes were upon them. The terror of captivity, the weight of secrecy, and the cold efficiency of the widow's plans had stripped them of individuality, leaving only the hollow form of obedience. Josephine recognized the echo of her own fear reflected in their posture, the same shadows that haunted their expressions. Isaiah's heart ached, but he remained unseen, cataloging, memorizing, planning. To intervene too soon would doom them all. To delay was agony, yet necessity demanded patience. By midnight the storm had intensified. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind shrieked through broken shutters, carrying with it the scent of mud and marsh water. Josephine traced the ledger's diagrams once more, memorizing the intersections of rooms, the placement of doors, the timings of candlelight. Clara, beside her, shivered slightly, acknowledging for the first time the grim reality that their mother's power was not just psychological but systemic, structural, and nearly inescapable. Every movement, every breath, every whispered word had been anticipated and catalogued. The house itself had become a participant, its creaks, groans, and sighs part of the widow's machinery. Isaiah, crouched among the azaleas, watched the servants' movements, noting the patterns that would allow him to reach the hidden chamber without detection. A candle flickered through a window of the upper hall, illuminating the widow's face, pale and unyielding, her black eyes reflecting the storm outside. For a moment, the universe seemed suspended, the estate frozen in anticipation. The pulse of Harrow Hall, long synchronized to the widow's will, seemed to tremble in response to the alignment of observers within and without. The revelation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its clarity. Josephine understood the full scope of the widow's intentions. Her daughters were not merely instruments, they were both subjects and enforcers. The ledger had mapped not only the household but the bloodlines, projecting the widow's obsession into the very marrow of life. Every arrival, every disappearance, every quiet night had been calculated for a precise outcome. Josephine felt a cold resignation at first, but it quickly hardened into resolve. Knowledge had become her weapon. As the storm abated, the estate seemed to breathe once more, settling into a tense, charged quiet. Daughters retreated to their rooms, servants to their corners, and the widow returned to her study, unaware of the silent observers aligning against her. Josephine and Isaiah, though separated by floors and walls, shared the same knowledge now. The widow's designs, her meticulous control, and her cruel manipulations had been revealed. The collapse of secrecy, once unimaginable, now seemed possible, fragile, and within reach. The first steps toward defiance had been taken. Harrow Hall, for all its grandeur and dread, was not invincible. The revelation had shattered the veil of inevitability, exposing the intricate machinery of oppression, and planting the seed that would grow into the confrontation yet to come. The storm passed, leaving mist along the river and cold dew on the grass. But inside, the pulse of the estate, the heartbeat of the widow's obsession, continued, waiting for the moment when knowledge and courage would finally converge against her unyielding will. The river beyond Harrow Hall ran slow and swollen, carrying the last vestiges of autumn storms into the marshes and then beyond, as though the land itself sought to wash away the sins of the estate. Yet within the house, silence had not returned. Shadows lingered longer than they ought, the echo of footsteps whispered in empty halls, and candle flames trembled as though anticipating some unseen presence. The widow's control had been challenged, though she remained unaware of the quiet resistance growing beneath her careful dominion. Josephine and Isaiah, allies forged by necessity and shared knowledge, moved through the estate with a caution born of months of observation, their every step a countermeasure against the widow's scrutiny. It was the first night after the revelation when the daughters fully understood the extent of their mother's designs. Clara, once resigned to her role as the obedient instrument, now faced the haunting reflection of her own participation. Her movements had always been precise, almost mechanical, but the ledger's revelations had shown her the depth of moral complicity that could not be ignored. She gazed out over the river, the black water reflecting faint moonlight, and wondered whether loyalty to family could ever absolve one from the cruelty embedded in lineage and inheritance. Josephine, meanwhile, traced her mother's ledger once more, memorizing patterns, cataloging entrances and exits, and noting the smallest irregularities in candlelight and shadows that might offer a path toward liberation. The servants had begun to shift subtly in their loyalty. Agatha, the head house slave, continued her outward show of obedience, but Isaiah had discerned a hidden tension in her steps, a flicker of indecision when passing the widow's study. Phyllis, the kitchen slave, remained steadfast, guiding the hidden communications that allowed Josephine and Isaiah to map the estate's secret routes. Even Jonas, the old man from the stables, whispered fragments of knowledge about the hidden corridors and the infirmary's layout, each piece a key in the puzzle of resistance. Harrow Hall, once an unyielding mechanism of surveillance, had begun to harbor fractures in its architecture, both physical and moral. That night, the storm returned, wind rattling the shutters and river water creeping into the marshes with renewed intent. Inside, the widow paced her study, unaware that her ledger had been copied, that Josephine had memorized the intricate diagrams, and that her daughters were beginning to question the morality of their upbringing. Every footstep she took resonated like a challenge to the unseen eyes that now watched her, mapping her intentions and predicting her next moves. Shadows coalesced in corners, almost sentient, as though the house itself acknowledged the shift in balance, the first tremors of resistance. The younger women in the hidden chambers sensed the tension, even if they did not know its full cause. Their confinement had become slightly less rigid. Meals arrived on a more precise schedule, doors were left momentarily ajar, and glances were exchanged that carried unspoken promises of hope. Josephine had begun to communicate with them through small, covert signals. Books, gestures, even subtle rearrangements of objects that indicated timing and opportunity. Each woman, once rendered powerless, now harbored a fragile thread of possibility, a secret awareness that they were not alone, that escape and defiance could someday be realized. The widow's obsession, once absolute, began to fray at the edges. Candlelight no longer illuminated only her authority, it revealed the spaces where observation could take place unnoticed. Nightly inspections grew more careful, but the daughters and servants had learned the rhythms, the patterns, and the signals that allowed movement without detection. Isaiah's presence became a shadowed counterforce, a careful integration into the household that left the widow unaware of the full scope of his surveillance. He catalogued every interval, every motion, every step of those who had once been entirely visible and subservient. By the middle of the night, Josephine and Isaiah had begun to test the boundaries. A corridor previously thought impassable was navigated with precision. A guard's routine was subtly altered, unobserved by the widow. The hidden chamber's locks, previously considered impregnable, revealed vulnerabilities through repetition and careful observation. The pulse of the estate, once in perfect alignment with the widow's will, now beat irregularly, responding to the movements of those who dared to challenge the imposed order. Harrow Hall itself seemed to hold its breath, the floorboards creaking as if in anticipation, the candle flames shivering as if alert to an approaching change. The daughters wrestled with the weight of inherited complicity. Clara, previously unmoved by the ledger's horrors, now felt the stirrings of guilt and fear intertwining with the recognition of opportunity. Josephine, her resolve sharpened by observation and careful planning, guided her sisters and the loyal servants, weaving together the fractured knowledge of the estate into a blueprint for confrontation. Each action, subtle and precise, carried the weight of potential consequence, the silent understanding that any misstep could unravel months of preparation and invite irrevocable disaster. Morning brought a muted light over the marshes. Rain had left the landscape wet and reflective, and the river flowed thickly, reflecting the gray skies above. Within Harrow Hall, the widow moved as though nothing had changed, but her dominion had been quietly challenged. The daughters and the servants now operated with a shared consciousness, a tacit alliance born of necessity. The hidden chambers, once silent and fearful, contained whispers of hope. Each woman understood the contours of oppression, the patterns of surveillance, and the narrow avenues through which defiance could be enacted. Josephine, her journal now filled with observation and strategy, noted the first subtle victories. A note passed unseen, a lock slightly eased, a guard misdirected by careful timing. Isaiah continued his mapping of the estate, memorizing routes, patterns, and vulnerabilities. Clara, hesitant yet determined, began to adopt small, deliberate deviations in her movements, teaching her mother's gaze to overlook what it had once controlled completely. The balance of power, once absolute, was now fragile and contingent, poised on a knife edge between the widow's perception and the hidden coalition growing beneath her feet. As the sun rose higher, lighting the estate in harsh clarity, the widow maintained her routines, unaware of the subtle undermining at work. The daughters, Isaiah, and loyal servants moved with purpose, unseen but resolute. The house itself seemed to hum with quiet tension, the walls echoing with the anticipation of an inevitable reckoning. The ledger, so long a symbol of tyranny and calculation, now served as both map and warning, guiding the resistance with every meticulous notation and charted line. By the time twilight fell, the stage was set. The widow's obsession had revealed itself, and the responses it provoked were coalescing into something that Harrow Hall had never experienced, the first real threat to her absolute control. Shadows moved with deliberate purpose, corridors were navigated with care, and the pulse of the estate, long dominated by her authority, now responded to a new rhythm. The balance had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly but irrevocably. And yet, the estate waited, its candlelight flickering in quiet anticipation. Harrow Hall, with all its grandeur, menace and secret knowledge, had become a crucible in which the forces of oppression, resistance and revelation now coexisted. The widow, brilliant and calculating, had underestimated the persistence of observation, the power of knowledge, and the inevitability of exposure. By the end of the evening, the first threads of rebellion had taken root, and the legacy of Harrow Hall would never again be the same. The morning mist clung to the marshes like a ghostly veil, obscuring the winding paths that led to Harrow Hall. Even the river seemed subdued, its surface glassy and unbroken, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of the unfolding reckoning. Inside the house, the widow moved with her usual calculated precision, unaware that the subtle tremors in her dominion had already begun to coalesce. Josephine, now fully attuned to the rhythms of the estate, watched her mother from a shadowed alcove, noting the small gestures, the habitual pacing, and the way the widow's sharp eyes swept over her ledger with meticulous care. Isaiah had spent the pre-dawn hours mapping the corridors beneath the east wing, the hidden staircases, and the network of passages leading to the infirmary where the captive women remained. Every door, every lock, every routine was etched into his memory with careful fidelity. Tonight, he would attempt to reach Ruth, his sister, whose soft cries and whispered prayers had haunted him since his arrival. The storm from the previous night had left the garden sodden, providing cover for movement and muffling the subtle noises of feet on stone floors. Shadows became allies, and the mist itself a cloak for the defiant. In the daughters' quarters, the atmosphere was tense but charged with purpose. Clara, once docile, now moved with deliberate caution, her every motion measured against the widow's predictable scrutiny. Beatrice, still trembling from the knowledge of her impending induction into her mother's cruel system, clutched a small talisman, an object of her own making, a charm against despair and a symbol of secret resistance. Josephine, holding her journal like a lifeline, whispered instructions in barely audible tones, guiding the small network of allies that had begun to operate in the cracks of the estate's authority. By mid-morning, the household had settled into a deceptive calm. The widow, seated in her study, tallied accounts and reviewed charts of bloodlines, unaware that the ledger she had relied upon for decades was now the instrument of its own undoing. She meticulously annotated names, numbers, and outcomes, her sharp eyes catching every detail except the quiet alignment forming beyond her gaze. Josephine had memorized every fold, every note, and every sequence, turning the widow's obsession into a tool for liberation. Isaiah's plan required both timing and precision. The guard's shifts, the servants' movements, the intervals between inspections, all had been observed, calculated, and rehearsed mentally. He waited for the moment when the widow's attention would be consumed by her daughter's afternoon lessons, a ritual that offered a window of opportunity. From his vantage point among the overgrown hedges, he could see the east wing's back entrance, the passage leading to the infirmary, and the faint flicker of candlelight in a hidden chamber, Ruth's room. Every heartbeat carried the weight of months of fear and hope, and every breath was a silent prayer for her safety. Inside the infirmary, Ruth sat quietly, her infant cradled in her arms, the faint aroma of herbs and damp stone filling the room. She sensed something different that day, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the household, the slight misalignment of guards, the fleeting shadows of movement that did not belong to the widow. Though she did not know the full extent of the plotting beyond her chamber, her instincts told her that change was coming. The other women, observing her with quiet envy and shared fear, leaned closer as she whispered tentative hope, a wordless communication that conveyed more than speech ever could. By afternoon, the alignment of actors within Harrow Hall reached critical mass. Josephine, moving with the precision learned over months of clandestine observation, guided her sisters through tasks that seemed mundane but were vital to the larger plan. Clara's duties in the kitchen and Beatrice in the gardens became conduits for subtle manipulation, misdirecting attention, creating small gaps in observation, and providing Isaiah with the paths he needed to navigate the estate unseen. The pulse of the house, long dominated by the widow's rigid control, began to respond to these hidden forces, its creaks and groans echoing faintly like a chorus of unacknowledged resistance. As twilight approached, the shadows lengthened and deepened, mingling with the lingering mist from the marshes. Isaiah, cloaked in darkness and drenched from a brief rain, slipped through the garden paths, every step a negotiation with the risk of discovery. He paused beneath the east wing, listening to the distant voice of the widow as she instructed her daughters on the proprieties of estate management and bloodline considerations. The voice, commanding yet unaware, provided the cadence he had memorized, marking the intervals for movement and ensuring that no misstep would betray his presence. The infirmary awaited, silent and foreboding, the thick walls holding centuries of secrets and the pain of those who had been forced into the widow's cruel experiments. Ruth, sensing the approach, pressed her infant closer, her mind racing with hope and fear. The other women, alert to every shadow and every sound, held their breath in quiet anticipation. The alignment of watchers, guides, and resistors was now complete, a delicate lattice of human will poised against the widow's long reign of control. Finally, Isaiah reached the hidden entrance. The lock, weakened by months of observation, yielded with a quiet click, revealing the passage that led directly into the heart of the infirmary. The candlelight within flickered as if in recognition, casting long shadows across the stone floor and the women waiting anxiously. Ruth's eyes met his, a mixture of disbelief, hope, and fear mirrored in her gaze. Josephine's whispered instructions, carried subtly through small signals and reflections of candlelight, confirmed the alignment of their actions. All pieces had converged, and the moment of confrontation loomed like a storm on the horizon. The widow remained oblivious in her study, her attention absorbed by charts, ledgers, and the faint scent of ink. She could not yet sense the orchestration of defiance taking form beneath her gaze, the quiet gathering of knowledge and courage that had grown in the shadows. Harrow Hall, long a bastion of calculated oppression, now stood on the precipice of revelation. The pulse of the estate, which had obeyed her will without question, now beat in anticipation of the collapse that would soon follow. And so, as the final light of day faded into an oppressive twilight, the convergence of secrets, knowledge, and courage reached its tipping point. The widow's dominion, built upon fear, observation, and ruthless calculation, faced the first true test. The threads of resistance, carefully woven through months of observation, risk, and quiet defiance, were ready to unravel the carefully constructed world of Harrow Hall. The estate's long-held shadows now danced to a rhythm of unseen rebellion, and the storm that had once brought fear now served as a cloak for the emergence of hope.